The wind that moved through that canyon didn't behave like wind anywhere else. It came in low, pressing against the dry grass in long, slow waves, as if something beneath the earth was exhaling. The rocks on the eastern face held the heat of the day long after the sun had dropped behind the ridgeline, and the air around them smelled faintly of cedar and something older, something without a name. The creek that ran along the floor of the valley was narrow enough to step across in 3 places, but it ran clear and cold even in the driest months, which was why men had been settling near it for decades, and why those who had been there long before them had never entirely left. Callum Reese had ridden into that stretch of territory 11 years before with a horse, a bedroll, a hammer, and $63. He had built the ranch by hand, literally. The calluses on his palms were so old and layered they had become part of his skin rather than something grown on top of it. The main house was low and solid, made of adobe and timber, with a roof that had survived 2 winters that collapsed nearly every other structure within 20 miles. He had no partner, no family close by, and no particular ambition beyond keeping what he'd built from falling apart. That was enough. For 11 years, it had been enough. The morning it changed started the way most mornings did, with the sound of the rooster that he had never asked for and had never managed to get rid of, and with the smell of dust already thick in the air before he'd opened his eyes. He pulled on his boots, drank water from the jug on the table, and walked out to check the fence line on the south pasture. His ranch hand, a young man named Tomas Arriaga, had reported a break the evening before. Something had come through the wire, probably a buck moving fast, and the posts on one section had gone sideways. He found the fence, he found the break, and he found, crouched on the wrong side of it, inside his property line, a woman. She was Apache, that much was clear. She wore a cloth wrap around her shoulders over a dress that had once been dark blue and was now the color of dried mud. Her hair was loose and matted at the back, and her feet were bare, which told him she hadn't ridden in. She was sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, not sleeping, not unconscious, just still, with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to wait and has been doing it long enough that waiting has become its own kind of rest. Callum stood on his side of the broken fence and looked at her. She did not look back. "Ma'am?" he said, which was the only word that came to him first. Nothing. He crouched down so he wasn't looking at her from above. She was younger than he'd thought from a distance, maybe 30, maybe a few years under. There was a bruise along the left side of her jaw, yellow at the edges in a way that said it was a few days old rather than fresh. Her hands, resting on her knees, had dried blood in the creases of the knuckles. "You need water?" he asked. She turned her head very slightly, not enough to look at him directly, and said something in Apache that he didn't understand. Then she was still again. Callum had lived near Apache territory long enough to know that the worst thing a man could do in a moment like this was make a decision too fast. He stood up, walked back to his horse, pulled the canteen from the saddle, and set it on the ground between them. He walked back to his side of the fence and started repairing the post without looking at her. He was not a man who talked much when there was nothing worth saying. He worked the post back into the ground, re-wrapped the wire, hammered the staples back flush, and when he was done he looked over to check the canteen. It was empty. She had set it back on its side carefully. She was still there. He fixed the rest of the fence. He didn't ask her anything. When the work was done, he picked up the canteen, touched the brim of his hat in her direction without quite looking at her, and rode back toward the house. Tomas was at the well when Callum came in. He was 22, quick with his hands, and had an expression that he was constantly trying to make neutral and rarely succeeding at. He looked at Callum, then at the empty canteen, then back at Callum. "Apache woman," Callum said, before Thomas could ask. "South fence. She's not moving and she's not talking. Should I ride for—" "No." Callum dismounted and tied the horse. "Leave her alone." Tomas opened his mouth and then closed it. He'd worked the ranch long enough to understand that when Callum said something that short and that flat, the subject was done. But by late afternoon, when Callum went back to check the animals in the south pasture, she was still there. She had moved maybe 10 feet. She was now sitting against the fence post rather than crouched in the open. The wrap around her shoulders had been pulled tighter, and she had her eyes closed. The wind had picked up, and it was blowing her hair across her face. She wasn't doing anything about it. He brought water again, and dried meat and a folded cloth. He left them at the wire and went about his business. The next morning she was inside the fence line. Not inside his house, not near the house. She had moved perhaps 50 feet past the broken section of fence and was sitting against a boulder at the edge of the pasture. She was watching the horses in a way that didn't look like threat or desire. It looked like the same thing the horses were doing with the horizon, a kind of passive awareness, awake but not quite engaged. Callum decided that a person who moved that slowly and sat that still was probably not going to become a problem. He left food at the fence again. It went like that for 3 days. On the 4th day, Thomas found him at the tool shed and said quietly that there was something Callum should probably see. He followed the younger man to the south end of the pasture, where the woman was standing near the fence in the midday heat. She had one hand pressed flat against the cheek of Callum's bay mare, a horse that had taken 2 years to stop shying from strangers, and that Callum had never seen allow a person she didn't know to touch her. The horse had her head low, ears soft. The woman wasn't doing anything. She was just standing there with her palm against the mare's face, and the mare was letting her. If this story is keeping you here, a like helps the channel keep bringing these narratives every week. Tomas looked at Callum. Callum looked at the woman. "Go fix the irrigation pipe on the north end," he told Tomas. "But go!" He walked over to the pasture fence and stood near it. The woman heard him coming. She had to have heard him, but she didn't move her hand from the mare's cheek. She still wasn't looking at him directly, but she spoke. One phrase in Apache, the same one she had said the first morning, and then she waited. "I don't know what that means," Callum said. She looked at him then. Not a long look, 3, maybe 4 seconds, and then she looked back at the horse. Her eyes were dark and steady, and had the quality of someone who has seen enough not to be surprised by much. The bruise on her jaw had faded to a shadow. "You can stay," he said. "If you need to. I'm not going to make you leave." She didn't respond to that either, but she stayed. Her name, he learned gradually, was Tsunaki. He learned it not from her directly. She still said almost nothing to him in the first 2 weeks, but from an old Apache man named Delguy, who appeared at the edge of the property on the 8th day and stood at the far fence line until Callum went out to meet him. Delguy was perhaps 70, with a face like a map of every drought that Valley had ever seen, and he spoke enough English to make himself understood. "The woman," Delguy said. "Her name is Tsunaki. She is my brother's daughter." "She's not harmed," Callum said. "I know." Delguy looked past him toward the house. "She won't go back." "She doesn't have to." The old man was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. A hawk turned slow circles overhead. "You know what she is carrying?" Delguy asked. "No," Callum said. "She hasn't told me anything." Delguy looked at him for a long time, measuring something. Then he said, "She will, when she is ready." He touched the fence post once, lightly, as if greeting it, and walked back in the direction he had come from. Tsunaki had been watching from the porch. When Callum came back, she was already gone. He found her behind the barn, sitting in the strip of shade against the eastern wall. She had brought out the folded cloth he had left at the fence over a week ago and spread it on her knees, and she was using a small stick to draw something on the cloth in a line of small, careful marks. He didn't ask what they were. He sat down on the other side of the barn wall, in the shade on his end, and rolled a cigarette. And they were like that together, separated by a few feet of adobe, until the shadow shifted and the heat became manageable, and Thomas called from across the yard that supper was getting cold. She didn't eat with them. She ate what he left on the step outside and left the tin in the same place she'd found it, wiped clean. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, a version of ordinary life reassembled itself around the strangeness of the situation. Callum worked the ranch. Thomas worked the ranch. Tsunaki was simply there, moving through the periphery of the property, sometimes sitting by the horses, sometimes near the creek, sometimes visible in the pasture at the edge of his sight while he worked, sometimes not visible at all. She slept in the barn. He'd set up a bedroll on the clean hay in the back corner, and she'd arranged the blankets in a particular way that she always returned to exactly the same position, as if the order mattered for reasons he didn't understand. She had started doing things without being asked. Small things at first. The water troughs, always full when he came in the morning. The saddle he'd left hanging wrong, corrected. The loose hinge on the chicken pen, tied closed with a strip of rawhide that was neater than what he would have done. Then larger things. She was repairing something in the fence line one afternoon when he came up on her from behind and saw that she was using a technique he hadn't taught her, twisting the wire differently in a way that was actually stronger than his own method. He didn't say anything about any of it. One evening he came in from the north field, and she was on the porch, crouching near the door, doing something to the threshold that he couldn't quite see. He stopped at the bottom step. She looked up at him, not away, directly at him, for the second time, and this time she held it for longer than 4 seconds. "There's a draft," she said, in English. Her voice was lower than he had expected, and careful, like someone choosing every word before releasing it. He stood there for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to fix it. I fixed it. Thank you." She stood up, stepped past him off the porch, and walked toward the barn. He stayed at the bottom step a little longer than he needed to. After that, she spoke occasionally, not often, and never about herself. She told him when the roan gelding was favoring his left front leg. She told him which section of the creek was running lower than it should be, and what that usually meant. She told him, once, without preface, that the hawk he'd been watching build a nest in the dead cottonwood at the south end had been there every year for 6 years, and he didn't know how she knew that or why she mentioned it, but he believed her. He stopped trying to figure out what she was doing on his property and started simply being glad she was there. This is the part of the story that looks like its own ending. 2 months after she had crouched on the wrong side of his broken fence, life on the Reese Ranch had arranged itself into something that felt almost deliberately designed, as if this was how it had always been meant to be, and the 11 years before were just the prologue. Tsunaki was sleeping in the barn, but she was eating at the table now, 3 nights a week at first, then most nights. Thomas had stopped treating her like a question he was afraid to ask out loud, and started treating her like someone he worked alongside. The bay mare that had never allowed a stranger to touch her had taken to following Tsunaki along the fence line in the afternoons. Callum noticed things he didn't comment on, the way she woke before anyone else and walked the full perimeter of the property in the dark, the same route every morning. The marks on the cloth she had brought, he had seen her add to them twice, a careful addition each time, and he understood eventually that she was counting something, though he didn't know what. The way she sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and stood completely still for a full minute, not distracted, not lost, just stopped, like a clock that had been briefly paused. He liked her. He had known it for a while and had filed it under things that didn't require action and that he was not going to examine too closely. And then Delguy came back. He didn't come alone this time. There were 3 others with him. 2 men Callum didn't recognize, and a younger woman who hung back near the horses. They came in the afternoon, which was not a hostile time to arrive, and Delguy put his hand up when Callum came out, palm forward, which Callum understood. But the conversation that followed was not what he had been prepared for. Delguy asked to speak to Tsunaki. Callum went to find her. She was in the barn, working on something with the gelding's saddle. When he told her, she put down the leather she was holding and stood still for a moment, in the way she sometimes stood still, and the quality of that stillness was different from the ones he had seen before. "You don't have to go out there," he said. "I know," she said. She picked up the leather again, set it back down, and walked out of the barn. He followed at a distance, because he was not sure he was supposed to. What happened in the yard was something he could not hear and was not meant to hear. Delguy spoke to Tsunaki in Apache. The others stood back. She listened without moving. Callum stood at the edge of the porch and watched her shoulders, because her face was turned away. He had been watching a woman who carried something carefully for 2 months. He had learned to read the carrying, in the way she moved, in the pauses, in the counting on the cloth. He thought he had understood it to be grief. Simple, enormous, private grief, the kind that a person takes somewhere quiet to tend. He was not entirely wrong, but he was not entirely right. After perhaps 10 minutes, Delguy stopped speaking. Tsunaki was quiet for a long time. Then she said something, 3 short sentences, and Delguy bowed his head once and said something back. The younger woman near the horses made a sound that wasn't quite a word. The 4 visitors left. Tsunaki did not watch them go. She walked back to the barn. Callum waited a minute and then followed. She was sitting on the floor of the barn with her back against the stall, her knees up, her arms around her knees, in the exact same posture he had first seen her in, crouched at the fence, pulled into herself. For a moment, it was like the 2 months between had not happened, and he felt a drop of cold run through him that he couldn't explain. He sat down across from her. She didn't tell him to leave. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then she said, "My son." 2 words. She said them looking at the ground. Callum waited. "He was 6, she said. There was a sickness in our camp, the kind that moves fast." She pressed her lips together. "He was the 3rd to die. I buried him 3 weeks before you found me at your fence." The barn was very quiet. Outside, somewhere, Thomas was moving around near the well. The bay mare shifted in her stall. "I'm sorry," Callum said. She nodded once, a small, deliberate movement. "Delguy wanted me to go back," she said. "He said I had stayed here long enough, that it was not right." She paused. "He means well. He has always meant well. Are you going to go back?" She looked up. Not at him, past him, at the wall, at something on the wall that wasn't there. "I don't know where back is," she said. "The place I was living, the camp near the northern ridge, it was already moving when I left. My son is buried there, but the camp will be somewhere else by now. Everything moves." She said it without bitterness, as a fact. "I have been moving my whole life, and I am tired of it." Callum sat with that for a while. "You're not being asked to move here," he said finally. "You've been here for 2 months. That's not moving." She looked at him. "What is it?" she said. And the question was serious. She was actually asking, not testing him, not being guarded. She wanted to know what he thought she was doing, what category she was in his understanding. He thought about it. "Staying," he said. The word landed in the quiet of the barn and stayed there. Subscribe to the channel if you want to follow stories like this one every week. Tsunaki looked at her hands. The dried blood was long gone from her knuckles, but there were older marks there, small scars across the backs that he had noticed before and had never asked about. "The marks on the cloth," he said. "What are you counting?" She was still for a moment. Then she unfolded the cloth from inside her wrap. She still had it on her, folded against her ribs, and spread it across her knees. The marks were in rows of 5, the way a person marks time in a cell. There were 43 marks. "Days," she said, "since I buried him." He looked at the cloth and then at her. "I was afraid," she said, "that if I stopped counting I would forget how many days it had been, and if I forgot how many days it had been, I would start to forget him." She folded the cloth again. "It doesn't make sense." "It makes sense," he said. She looked at him with some skepticism. "I'm not a man who says things to make people feel better," he said. "I mean, it makes sense." She didn't exactly smile, but something around her eyes changed, a faint shift, the kind of thing a person only catches if they've been paying close enough attention. Callum had been paying attention. He stood up, because it seemed like the moment that required it, and he picked up the leather she had been working with when he'd come in to find her. "Saddle stitch needs to go a different way here," he said, pointing at the seam. "Want me to show you?" She got up slowly and looked at where he was pointing. "I know how to stitch leather," she said. "I know you do. You do most things better than me, but this part specifically—" He turned the leather so she could see the underside of the seam. "This part, someone showed me a trick." She looked at the seam, then she held out her hand. He gave her the leather. She worked the stitch through twice and looked up. He nodded once. She kept working. That was November. In February, when the cold had settled fully into the canyon and the creek ran with a thin skin of ice at its edges in the mornings, Thomas left the ranch to go back to his family's land 2 territories east. It was not a surprise. He had been talking about it since autumn, and the parting was easy, the kind that happens between people who like each other and know they will cross paths again. Callum hired no one to replace him. Tsunaki did not suggest he should. They worked the ranch together through the winter and into the spring, and the arrangement had no name and didn't need one. She had moved from the barn at some point in December, not because he asked, but because the cold made the barn impractical, and because the arrangement had passed some threshold that neither of them had announced or negotiated. The cloth with the marks lived on the windowsill on her side of the house, folded, added to each morning. The count, by spring, had passed 150 days. She still walked the perimeter in the dark before dawn. He still woke to the sound of her returning and lay still until she came in, the way a person lying still is not exactly asleep, but is not ready to be awake either. The bay mare followed Tsunaki through the pasture every afternoon, without fail. The hawk returned to the dead cottonwood in March, exactly as she had said it would, and built the same nest in the same fork of branches. The day the hawk's eggs hatched, 4 of them in a nest they could see from the south fence line, she counted the chicks with the same careful attention she gave everything that needed counting. 4. She said the number quietly to herself, but he was standing beside her and he heard it. "Good number," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Why good?" "More than you expected is good." She was quiet for a moment. The hawk circled above, low and attentive. "Yes," she said. "More than you expected." She went back to work. Callum stood at the fence a moment longer, watching the hawk come down to land on the rim of the nest, folding its wings with the particular care of something that has somewhere it belongs and knows it. The cloth on the windowsill eventually stopped being added to. Not on any day he witnessed. he never saw her make the last mark. One morning it was simply there, folded as always, with a count that had stopped, and a different quality to the silence in the house, as if a door had been left open that had always been closed before. He didn't ask about it. She didn't explain. Some things don't need explaining. Years later, when people who passed through the valley asked about the ranch, the well-kept property on the creek, the bay mare that came to the fence when a particular woman walked the south pasture, the hawk's nest that appeared in the dead cottonwood every spring without fail, the answers were always a version of the same thing. That a man had built it alone and a woman had stayed, and that the place had a quality about it that most properties in that territory didn't have, something that was hard to name but easy to feel. Thomas, when he came back through 2 years later and sat on the porch with them in the evening, said it was the quietest ranch he had ever worked on, and also the one that felt the most alive. Tsunaki had handed him a tin cup and said nothing. Callum had looked out at the canyon in the last light, and the hawk had circled once above the cottonwood and settled into the nest the way it always did, as if that particular piece of sky above that particular piece of ground had always been exactly where it was supposed to be.